Good evening, everyone. To welcome us this evening, the president of St. Petersburg College, Dr. Bill Law.
Thank you. Good evening. Good to see you. Thank you so much. Welcome back. This is the second in a series of public policy forums that we have organized as we try to organize an ongoing institute for public policy development through St. Petersburg College. So welcome, welcome, welcome. We do so many great things at this college to serve your community and all the communities in Pinellas County, but nothing makes me prouder than opening our doors, inviting citizens onto our campus to use our facilities as part of a learning process that doesn't require enrollment and registration and fees and classroom learning, and there are no tests. So it's better than you even thought. But thank you. Welcome back. Tonight we have another distinguished panel, people who can help us to understand and put in perspective issues surrounding the oil spill and the crisis that we have been part of and that we are working our way through. I want to say thanks so much to the people who put this on, and I'll vacate, but I do need to recognize two people who put a great deal of time and energy in. Senator Dennis Jones and Representative Janet Long, both of them have used their great contacts. I just want them to deed to the college their Rolodex, because they can get anybody on the phone at any time. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to St. Petersburg College. Thank you for being with us tonight. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Dr. Law. As Dr. Law mentioned, this is the second in a series of 3 forums to deal with the oil spill crisis in the Gulf. The first to talk about impacts, the spill and the impacts. Tonight, we're going to be talking about lesson learned and where do we go from here. And we hope you'll be able to join us again on Saturday, October the 2nd, for the third in the series, where we'll be looking at longer-term solutions and energy policy questions. This evening, in addition to the Senator and Representative, we have a number of elected officials with us tonight, and very quickly, we have Bill Smith from Indian Shores Council. Bill? We have from Congressman Bill Young's office, we have Shirley Mayolis. Shirley? Ray Balcom from CFO Alex Sink's office. And the Vice Mayor of the City of Seminole, Leslie Waters. Leslie. We will be hearing again from Senator Jones and Representative Long at the end of this program. We also would like to thank our sponsors this evening, the St. Petersburg Times, Bright House, Bay News 9, the Tradewinds Resort, which provided a free night's lodging to all of those attending in the Digitorium this evening, the Florida Restaurant and Lodging Association, and the Florida Business Network for a Clean Energy Economy. Thanks also to the nonprofit organizations who set up tables before this event to underscore the importance of the forum: the Suncoast Seabird Sanctuary, the St. Petersburg Audubon Society, Repower America, the Clearwater Marine Aquarium, and Defenders of Wildlife. You have a cream-colored card in your program. We made some changes since the first forum. Please note we're asking you to address the question to a specific panelist. During the first forum, a number of questions were really not answerable by the individuals that we'd assembled, and so we want to make sure that we focus those questions. We're also asking you to print your email address so we can read it in order to respond to your question if it's not able to be answered during the formal program. For those of you viewing this via live stream, you can email your questions in to the address above, se_info@spcollege.edu. Our program this evening features 5 distinguished panelists, followed by questions from Ms. Glickman, many of those which were raised at the last forum, and then questions from the audience. After the last panelist speaks, we'll ask you to pass those cards to the center of the aisle, and one of the team members will bring them to the front. There are no scheduled breaks during this program, so if you need to take a call, use the restrooms, etc., just do so as needed. Again, welcome, and let's welcome geophysical engineer, energy analyst, and writer Dan Berard, whose full bio is in your program, to introduce our panel. Dan?
Thank you, Jim. This evening, we're going to put some of the technical capabilities of the college and of this facility on display. We have 5 speakers tonight, 2 of which are going to be given their presentations from the Emergency Command Center in Tallahassee. The first speaker we're going to have tonight is going to be the Coast Guard response from Joseph A. Boudreaux, Commander of the U.S. Coast Guard, and he's the Florida Deputy Incident Commander. The second presentation, also from the Live Interaction Connection, would be the state response, and that would be Director Henry E. Barnett, Division of Law Enforcement, Florida Department of Environmental Protection. Our third speaker will be Alan Farmer, who's Director of the RCRA Division, U.S. EPA Region 4. We also have, to give us the perspective from BP, Ray Dempsey, Director of Public Affairs and Government Relations. And our fifth speaker will deal with the response and responsibility of the media. We have Neil Brown, who is editor of our own St. Petersburg Times. Thank you all. Our first speaker I'd like to introduce will be Joseph A. Boudreaux, Commander of the U.S. Coast Guard, Florida Deputy Incident Commander. Welcome, Commander.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go right ahead.
All right. Thank you. First slide. I have a PowerPoint that we'll be showing. Did it go up? Can you see the PowerPoint?
Just a second.
Do you have the PowerPoint now?
Yeah, we're all set.
Okay. As indicated, I'm Commander Joseph Boudreaux, and I'm the Deputy Incident Commander for Florida under the Unified Incident Command of Mobile, Alabama. Normally, I'm assigned to the 1st Coast Guard District in Boston, and I volunteered to serve as the Florida Deputy Incident Commander. I reported into the Unified Incident Command in Mobile on June 17th for a quick in-brief, and then I flew to Tallahassee on the 18th of June. Since June 18th, I've been working throughout the Panhandle coordinating the Coast Guard's efforts in the oil spill response. Next slide. Some legal framework behind the Coast Guard's involvement. The Federal Water Pollution Control Act, which is also known as the Clean Water Act, it was amended by the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 in the wake of the Exxon Valdez disaster to provide a framework and a response for oil spill response. Those amendments vested broad power in the President, which is exercised in accordance with the National Contingency Plan. The National Contingency Plan provides the organizational structure, including the flow of authorities for oil spill response. And under the NCP, a federal on-scene coordinator leads the Unified Area Command to implement regional and area contingency plans to ensure that an oil spill response is well coordinated. The National Contingency Plan prompts each state governor to designate one state official or agency to serve as the planning committee and to designate a lead agency during the response. And for Florida, the Department of Environmental Protection, under the leadership of Secretary Mike Soule, filled this role for this response. Next slide. Under the National Contingency Plan, the Coast Guard sector commanders are pre-designated as the federal on-scene coordinators for oil spills in the coastal zone. And for Mobile, Captain Steve Poulin, who's my boss in the spill, he was serving as sector commander of Mobile, and he became the federal on-scene coordinator. And his area of operations included Mississippi, Alabama, and the Florida Panhandle, up to Taylor County. As the oil spill started heading east, Captain Poulin, he consulted with both the Unified Area Commander, which at the time was Admiral Jim Watson, and the National Incident Commander, Admiral Thad Allen, and he expressed that he needed some representation in each of the 3 states. So I was brought down, and my orders were to represent the Federal On-Scene Coordinator here in Florida. And I became Florida's direct link with Mobile, and I worked with Florida to organize the response efforts in the Panhandle. In addition to the Coast Guard FOSC, in the state SOSC, a senior-level BP representative with decision-making authority was assigned to assist in developing operational objectives, directing tactical operations, and developing external messaging to improve communications. And for BP, this position is filled by Mary Schaefer-Malicki. And all three of us ICs, we work together out of the state's Emergency Operations Center here in Tallahassee. My first objective was to coordinate response operations. So we organized the Panhandle into 4 branches to streamline the response. Our branches were staffed by personnel from the Coast Guard, from EPA, BP, the state, and county personnel. They all worked together to utilize the right assets at the right time in the right place, and this allowed for a more rapid and coordinated response. Key to the success of the branches was the incorporation of county representatives. By drawing on the local knowledge of the community, we were able to provide a better service to the public. And as everybody says, all disasters are local, and without local participation in the response effort, the response is in danger of failing. Through the state, we were able to arrange that each branch had a mobile command vehicle assigned to it to help with command and control and communications. The command vehicle in this picture is from Duval County. It was brought in to assist Branch 2, which was stood up at Henderson State Park near Destin. And this vehicle actually departed this afternoon and is heading back to Jacksonville as we speak. Beach operations. The majority of the operations here in Florida was impacts to our beaches. Some of the concerns we had for the beaches was the high heat index, which was affecting the people working on the beach. Environmental concerns such as turtle nesting and endangered beach mice. Plus we had the obstacles of coordinating with tourist events such as concerts and air shows. The majority of the oil affecting Florida has been in the form of tar balls. Basically what tar balls are is as the light ends of the petroleum product evaporate off, the oil becomes thick like a small piece of tar, and as it breaks up into smaller pieces and it mingles with the sand on the beach. Problems that we had was in the heat that was in the middle of the day. It makes it difficult to pick up the tar balls because they get mushy and sticky, and they make it difficult to remove. So we had our operations consist early morning and then night ops to help fix the heat problem. But when we work in nights, we would run into problems with the turtle nesting and environmental concerns. Equipment to pick up the tar balls has evolved. We've started using mechanical beach rakes, and even the hand tools like rake-like shovels have been incorporated to reduce the amount of sand collected when the tar balls are picked up. Also, workers, as you see in the photo, they were putting the oil and tar balls in bags, but many of the locations were now using buckets to reduce the amount of plastic going into the landfills. Tar balls washing ashore in the surf was part of an issue. We were trying to collect the tar balls before they actually got into the sand. So in this photo here, you see folks deploying snare boom into the surf to collect the tar balls before they actually hit the beach. And this was somewhat effective, but it was a little bit dangerous with having people in the surf line. Sand issues for beach ops on Pensacola Beach in July. The oil that was coming ashore was more like liquid. We were calling it mousse. It wasn't really tar balls. The mousse and the tar balls became covered with clean sand as the tide changes, and this becomes a problem for cleanup. We were requiring heavy equipment to scrape away the clean sand so the workers could get to the oil. And this is actually going to be a long-term concern as the beaches build in the summer and decrease in the winter months. We could have the chance of some more of this tar balls reoccurring as the sand moves. For the equipment, vast amounts of equipment were mobilized for this response. Equipment staging areas have sprung up all throughout the Panhandle. In Pensacola, Bio Chico became a major center and still is a major center of operations. In Port St. Joe, large amounts of equipment have been staged. In these pictures, you see the Department of Emergency Management's command vehicle. This truck is presently serving as the command center for Branch 1 in Bio Chico. The other two photos show equipment, both boom anchors and absorbent pads staged in Port St. Joe. In Port St. Joe, BP has established a boom washing station, and they're cleaning the boom as it comes out of the water, washing the salt off of it and getting it ready to be staged and stored. Once the boom is cleaned, they've been sending it to Tallahassee, where there's a staging area here at an old airport, and they have several hundred thousand feet of boom already staged. When the spill first started happening, boom was the hot topic when I reported here to Tallahassee. It seemed like we couldn't get enough of it when the threat, and then came the threat of Hurricane Bonnie, and it quickly became obvious that we had too much boom. And the worry was that the hurricane was going to do more environmental damage by moving the boom across the wetlands than the tar balls would do. In Florida, at the peak, we had over 791,000 feet of boom deployed. So this became a huge concern. In the photo we have here, this is East Pass near Destin. This is boom being removed from East Pass. After the boom frenzy, skimmers became the hot topic. We couldn't get enough skimmers. We quickly learned that all skimmers were not created equal. Some skimmers work much better than others when dealing with the material that we had here. In this photo, you'll see drum skimmers. These are in Bio Chico. They were staged. And the drum skimmers actually turned out to be not very effective at this spill. Vessels of Opportunity. This was a real hot topic also. The Vessels of Opportunity program was established to employ fishermen who were put out of work by the oil spill, and they were used to help respond to the oil spill. VOOs were used in a variety of different ways. Some were used to actually pick up oil. Some had skimmers on them. Some even had like rakes with simple things like potato bags on them that the tar balls would stick to. Others were using some type of seine nets. Some were used as surveillance vessels looking for oil. Others were used as safety vessels. Some take water samples, a whole variety of means for the VOOs. This was kind of a management challenge. We had various fleets of VOOs running around, and we tried to get them, and we worked to get them under the operational control of the branches so we could provide a more rapid response. Transition and recovery. For the last 20 days, we haven't had any skimmable oil on the water. We do continue to get small tar balls washing ashore on certain beaches, but it seems that the brunt of this is coming to an end. So we need to transition to get our response to a recovery stage and have the right sizing of the staff. Approximately, we're working on boom removal now. There's about 8,900 feet of boom remaining in the water in Branch 1. We're working to get that boom removed and cleaned and staged. For Coast Guard personnel, I'm working to get the right size staffing so people are in the right locations so we don't have excess people around without any real job to do. And so my focus now is on right sizing things. And the last slide I want to do is commitment. On the 14th, last Saturday, President Obama was in Panama City Beach. He emphasized the federal government's commitment to ensuring the spill was cleaned up properly. And as the transition evolves, the Coast Guard will remain engaged to ensure the cleanup efforts are conducted properly. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Commander. We'll have a question and answer period later, so stay tuned. Our next speaker will be Director Henry Barnett.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Sorry, we turned down the volume. We're having some minor feedback with the volume. Thank you for the opportunity to present tonight. As Commander Boudreau said, it's been quite a long time we've been here at the EOC. We're at day 111. And I'd like to open up with the Oil Pollution Act. And I know Commander Boudreau touched on it. Where it falls into play with the state, and that's what I'm going to focus on, obviously, is the state response and our perspective of what we did good and what we could have done better. The Ocean Pollution Act, or the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, establishes the need for an area contingency plan. And what that basically establishes is a need for protective measures that are put together by state, local, and federal authorities to provide basically a measure that will protect our sensitive areas. And that's where the boom requirements come in that played such an integral part in the early parts of this response. Some states, some counties were integral in their input with the ACP, which is the Area Contingency Plan. What happened is some areas had very good plans set forth, other areas did not. Just because, Florida never really anticipated having any problems with an oil spill since we don't have any drilling offshore Florida. Obviously, we've learned from our misconceptions of not being impacted. Therefore, when the event happened, we had to use a $25 million block grant and basically establish boom plans for these areas and work with the counties to provide proper coverage and provide them with the necessary protection to these areas that they considered sensitive marshes, inlets, and so forth. What we later learned is boom was not the solution. The state of Florida response basically started April 30th when the state EOC was activated through the emergency or executive order from the governor's office. The Department of Environmental Protection was designated as a lead state agency under the direction of Secretary Mike Soul, who was designated as the incident commander. And basically, Florida focused on ensuring that our beaches were safe and tourists and residents were safe from the spill. We were very fortunate early on with the weather patterns that really pushed the spill towards Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. They really saw really heavy impacts early on and created us more time, gave us basically more time to enact our boom plans, provide strategies, and work through the unified command system in Mobile, Alabama, to further work on our effort. Through our effort, in May we began negotiating boom contracts for these affected counties. It was very difficult at that time. It was basically a panic. We didn't know how quickly we would be impacted as the gush oil from the well was estimated in various amounts, some high, some low. And again, the weather was our friend at the time. It was pushing it towards Louisiana, and which gave us more time. June 4th, unfortunately, we saw the first impacts, and that was tar balls. Those impacts affected Perdido, Key, and Escambia County. At the time we noticed was that Florida did not have quite the contingency we needed from the Coast Guard and BP to assist us with the response. We felt that it was sluggish at the time, and we felt a true need to kind of regroup and focus on a better communication system to improve the response. Through our booming efforts, we had approximately 800,000 feet of boom deployed at the peak. I'm happy to say at this point we're under 9,000 feet, and today didn't get the final report, but we should be at 0 by the end of the day, which is tremendous, considering Louisiana still has over 2 million feet of boom still in the water. And why that's so important is boom that's left in the water, with right now there's no threat of oil. We are getting tar ball effects, but boom has no protective measure with tar balls. It causes more damage than good at this point. You've got areas where anchors are dragging, boom is getting destroyed, it damages marshes, and in the worst case, when a storm comes, say a hurricane or tropical storm, boom becomes basically a missile, and it could get wrapped around trees and again cause much more damage than good at this point. One thing was established early on was the SCAT teams, and they are a state emergency response team member from the federal government and BP, and basically they conduct shoreline assessments. And SCAT is a shoreline cleanup assessment team, is what SCAT stands for. What they do is go out and basically it's the primary objective of SCAT is to process, provide operational support to the state of Florida and provide a systematic approach to look at the data and provide the best possible way to clean, whether it be marshes, beaches, whatever areas impacted by the oil. Through that comes development of cleanup standards, environmental benefits through these analysis, treatment and inspections, and primarily right now is a long-term support. They'll continue going out, assessing the areas, seeing what the impacts are, and basically if they need to continue cleanups. And again, as the tidal cycles come through, tar balls are buried, and to see how deep the impact is on our beaches and marshes and so forth. Early on, I'll take a step back with our response. After the initial response to Escambia County back on June 4th, we decided to establish the recon teams, and that was a state of Florida initiative. And basically what that was to respond by land, water, and air, basically to recon the areas, identify areas where oil has impacted the state, and report back to unified command so cleanup teams can respond in a timely manner to these areas, because we were getting numerous complaints from the counties and our local contingents that the response just wasn't quite as good as they would like. You had tourists out there, they were trying to enjoy the beaches, and the impacts were being seen but not cleaned up quite as quickly as they would like. Through our recon efforts, DEP, Fish and Wildlife, FHP, Florida National Guard, all these agencies participated and either patrolled the beaches on ATVs, by water, checked and responded to reports of whether it be sheen or tar balls, and by air was really the ideal way to spot these things so you cover so much more area and get a good visual of the areas that were impacted. And along with those recon plans, branches were established also. And that's where I feel this really turned around. And with the addition of Commander Boudreaux and Mary Schaefer-Maliki being decision makers within their organizations, that's when this really became a success. And I feel that our response was much better. They truly organized. The communication was much better with the counties. And we were able to really provide the necessary response that the counties required at that point. Those 4 branch offices, which were Pensacola, Destin, Panama City, and Port St. Joe, truly proved to be a good unified effort. And as Florida knows, we deal with hurricanes, floods, wildfires, you name it. And Florida has, through practice, become a very good responder. And I think that's where we shine. And where we had some difficulty at first was meshing together with the federal response type system that was established through the Open 1990 Act. As the recon was initiated, as you can see, we have our officers, and I say the state of Florida, whether it be DEP, FWC, or National Guard, responded, would identify areas, plot them through GPS, photograph them, and it would be plotted on the CERT Gator map, and that is a map, a geospatial map that's maintained by the Department of Emergency Management that could be viewed by Unified Command in Mobile. And they would, from that, pinpoint locations, pictures, and provide the appropriate response for cleanup crews to go and clean up these areas that were being impacted by whether it was tar balls, moose, or whatever type of impact they were being notified of. As Commander Boudreaux reported earlier, we continue to see impacts west of basically Gulf County. We especially Escambia, Santa Rosa, are seeing pretty heavy tar ball recoveries. Today they reported in Escambia or Branch 1 approximately 11,000 pounds of tar balls or oily product recovered. And again, this could be through tidal cycles. They received some pretty substantial impacts early on. And as the tidal cycles come through, it uncovers tar balls in areas that have oil. And so they continue to recover quite a bit and clean up quite a bit of that area. One of the important things, and this is on the science side, it's the natural resource damage assessment process. And that's basically a legal process referred to as NERDA, if any of you have heard that. What they do is they go out and take baseline samples of the areas before the impact, and that's where you see all those red dots around the state of Florida. Or very early on, they went out and started taking baselines. And what this process does is works with the responsible party to get the area back restored to where it was after the impacts. By doing the baseline, we know after the impacts where this should be as far as clean. And that's been one of the key questions, is how clean is clean. So they'll be working. This is a long process. They meet on a regular basis to discuss this data, continue taking samples. And I know that's one of the big issues that is current right now is all the different data that's out there and samples and what's clean, what's not clean, and what's safe and what's not safe. So this is going to be a long process. Our coastal and aquatic managed areas through DEP is managing this, and they'll continue to monitor it. And this could take years. The oil spill that occurred in Tampa in 1993, I believe it took over 7 years to finally get that resolved. And but again, it's a very important process, and we will maintain it and work through it through the entirety. Fish and wildlife also provided an integral part with the recovery of wildlife, whether it be cleaning wildlife. One of the key things they did is the relocation of sea turtles. They would take them from the West Coast and release them over in the East Coast so the hatchlings could go out into clean water and would not be impacted by any kind of oil in the water if there was that threat, which was quite vital at the time. One of the key things that is happening right now, and I think it started yesterday and it's been a topic of discussion, is basically the battle of our scientists, whether it be NOAA. I know USF, through their exploration and testing, came back yesterday and reported that basically their findings are different than what the NOAA is reporting. So I put this map up, or pie chart, of what has been reported to us by NOAA as far as where the oil's gone. USF has a different story. I know University of Georgia has also come out with some findings. And while they're preliminary, I know they're waiting on some final results. My hopes are, and I think everybody's hopes are, they end up working together and really figure out what is really happening out there, because I think there's a lot of unanswered questions. I think we all want to know, and I think we'll find out, because I think we have a lot of good academics working on this. So as these final tests come out, we'll, I'm sure, be hearing more in the very near future. Some of the lessons learned, and I put up here, the federal government was not prepared for an incident of this magnitude. I think none of us expected an incident of this magnitude. I obviously work for the state of Florida. I feel that our response capabilities are great, and through the addition of, again, Commander Boudreaux and BP's Mary Schaefer-Maliki coming and stepping into their roles with Florida, I think it really turned around our response efforts, which were a little lacking in the beginning as far as the timeliness of response to cleanups and so forth. A bit of it, I think, was based on panic. I think a lot of us didn't know what to expect. We were lucky. I feel we were very fortunate with the weather patterns and the way the oil was pushed towards other states, and really spared us of a lot of heavy impacts. State coordination was seamless, and that's a testament to the Department of Emergency Management, how they operate and how they work under one umbrella, whether you work for DEP, Fish and Wildlife, Department of Agriculture, it doesn't matter. Once we get in here, we all work together and work as a team, regardless of what agency you work for. The need for command posts, I think that was established, again, through the additions of the Coast Guard and BP decision makers coming to Florida and establishing the branch offices, which were really crucial parts to this event. Next slide. The other thing that we found out was the skimmers worked. There are many different types of skimmers. Some worked better in certain areas than others. Again, things such as drum skimmers work better on fresh product. We were looking at some pretty heavily weathered product closer to the state of Florida. Things as simple as a dip net was used to recover tar balls. So many different strategies were used, and through trial and error, I think they improved the process of skimming this product. Dispersants is a very hot topic right now. There were no dispersants used in Florida. And basically, what I've been told from the scientists is dispersants are basically soap and detergent. The oil is much more hazardous than these dispersants, but I know it's been a hot topic. I know through scientific research, we'll hopefully learn much more in the very near future. The area contingency plans, fundamental flaws were that some counties didn't participate. And I think that's a lesson learned for all the counties that did not. I think in the future we'll see a much better input from them. They'll be involved more, and again, have a more robust strategy to protect the counties from any potential spills that hopefully never occur again. But again, you need to be prepared. All the boom that has been recovered now is being staged, dry staged. It'll be available for future, if there are any future events, and there is probably an overabundance of boom at this point due to the amount of boom that was relocated to this area. The rush to deploy, again, it goes back to the boom. The lack of the area contingency plan was not quite as robust as it needed to be, so those extra monies were used, roughly $30 million, to increase our boom protection, which boom basically was not the solution, but at the time, not knowing any better, quite a bit of boom was deployed, and luckily we are about done with removing all that boom. One thing that DEP, State of Florida, did before and will continue to after this event is we normally responded to oil spill events. Under the Division of Law Enforcement with DEP, you had the Bureau of Emergency Response, and they respond to oil or hazardous material events on a routine basis. So as we ramp down this event, we are still responding. We'll still be receiving calls through the State Watch Office, and two of the numbers here, whether it's from a cell phone or a regular phone, or the dial-in numbers to report any kind of oiling events, whether it be on the beach related to Deepwater Horizon, whether it's tar balls, or it could be a tanker overturned on the highway. So again, we continue our response, and even as we ramp down from this event. Here we have the website information for DEP, and it's updated frequently. So you'll be able to keep up to date as to what's going on, and as we ramp down this event and get further scientific information will be posted on here to keep everybody informed. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Barnett, and thank you to technical support people in the EOC Command Center in Tallahassee, as well as here in Seminole campus of St. Petersburg College. Our next speaker will be here. It'll be Alan Farmer is going to talk to us about the impacts on health and the environment. Alan.
Thank you, and thank you again for inviting me here tonight. This is really a very, very beautiful auditorium. So for Commander Boudreau and Director Barnett, that's one thing you're missing out on, is being able to see this live and in person. Although maybe you can, I'm not sure. Maybe the technology is good enough that you have a webcam that you can see this auditorium as well. I'm not sure. My first slide is one that I'm sure you've all seen many, many times, and I just put that up there as we start talking about the EPA role in the oil spill response. Our response began almost at the same time as everyone else's did, the Coast Guard, other federal and state agencies. Just a little bit, a few quick slides to provide some background. The one issue here that I want to emphasize is, of course, what we all know. The well was shut in on July 15th, so no oil is flowing into the water from that well at this point. And the miles of shoreline, about 640 miles of shoreline is impacted or has been impacted. A little bit about how we get involved technically. The Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security declared the spill a spill of national significance. That's important for us because that designation allows the Coast Guard to leverage the full resources of the federal government, including EPA. My regional office is in Atlanta, Region 4. The Region 6 regional office is in Dallas, and we have quite a few people integrated into the Unified Command in New Orleans, in Homa, and in Mobile. In addition to that, we of course have quite a few people who have been almost from day one and continue to be very much involved in the emergency operations centers in our headquarters office in Washington, D.C., as well as in Atlanta and in Dallas. Just a few figures here regarding the response to date, and I've seen a lot of different numbers So I'll qualify it by saying this is not just in Region 4, not just our 3 states, but it includes Louisiana as well. But I've seen the number of vessels much higher than 5,054, so I'm not sure what the number of total response vessels is to date, but it's somewhere in that ballpark. As we've seen before, the total boom deployed is in the millions of feet when you combine Louisiana and the 3 states of Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida. Oily water recovered, more than 800,000 barrels. Dispersant used, a little over 1 million gallons on the surface and more than 771,000 gallons below the surface. And the overall personnel responding, again, I've seen some numbers higher than this, but the folks who put this together for me said at this point, this was about a week ago, the number was around 31,000, a little more than 31,000 people who've responded. And that's not just federal government, that's states, that's BP, that's contractors, truck drivers, boat captains, everyone who's been involved. As our previous 2 speakers mentioned, dispersant application has been very controversial. As I said earlier, and our previous 2 speakers did too, dispersant use ceased since the well was capped back in the middle of July, except for, I think there was about 200 gallons used on July 19th. One thing I'd like to point out that many of you have read about is that the Coast Guard and EPA issued a directive to BP back in May, late May. I think it was May the 26th when those directives were signed, initially signed, that had some very specific requirements for BP, requiring them to decrease the overall use of, or the volume of dispersants by 75%, to cease use of dispersants on the surface unless prior written permission was granted by the Coast Guard, and also to make sure that the data was available to the public in an easily obtained manner. And then the other thing I want to emphasize here, and it's in that second bullet when I mentioned that EPA issued a phase 2 dispersant toxicity testing. August 2nd, we had a press release out of our headquarters office regarding dispersant toxicity. And what we had done, the agency went back and did its own independent testing of 8 dispersants mixed with Louisiana sweet crude oil. The results indicated that the 8 dispersants had similar toxicities to one another when mixed with crude oil. Also, the dispersant and oil mixtures were found to be generally no more toxic to aquatic test species than the oil alone. And this is as good a time as any to point out to you, and I'll emphasize this later on as well, that our website, epa.gov/bpspill, has everything on it regarding the data that I'm providing you and much, much more. We're continuing to improve it, but in my opinion and the opinion of others that I've spoken with, they really have done a good job. I can't take any credit for that, but the folks who've put together that website have really done a good job with that. One other thing to point out is that we have asked for an additional $2 million appropriation for dispersant research. There's a lot of dispersant research already going on. We recognize that we need additional research, and we're hoping to be able to give grants to universities with oil spill dispersant use and ecological risk expertise with that $2 million. I'd like to talk a little bit about the sampling plans that we have underway next. We are very actively involved in air sampling, and water and sediment sampling, and in waste sampling. I'll talk about our waste management plans. I'll start though with air monitoring. We've had a massive air monitoring effort. When I say we, that's EPA, our states, as well as BP and their contractors. EPA is measuring 2 types of particulate matter, which we can refer to as particle pollution. Fine particles that are less than 2.5 micrometers in diameter, and coarse particles, which are smaller than 10 micrometers in diameter, are being measured. We're using our stationary air monitors that were in place prior to the spill, and many, many other means of monitoring not just those constituents that I mentioned earlier, but many others, as I mentioned here, air toxics, VOCs, volatile organic compounds. We are using, and I'll have a photograph on my next slide, what we refer to as TAGA, the Trace Atmospheric Gas Analyzer. There are two mobile sampling buses. Here's a photograph of the buses that have been used during the spill. Some of you, if you've been over around Mobile, may have seen those buses driving by, and they're analyzing air in real time. We've also used the small area arrays that I have a photograph here at the top, used for investigating odor complaints and to establish some baseline VOC data. And that says volatile organic carbon. It should be volatile organic compounds, readings in the parts per billion range. And we've also used a plane. The agency actually has a plane which we refer to as ASPECT, because it's called the aerial imagery and monitoring for shoreline and in situ burns. We've used it quite a bit, and it is still in use when needed for aerial imagery and monitoring. We've also used the SUMA canisters, or there's a small photograph there of what they look like, to get some quick information. And to date, the monitoring data that we've found doesn't indicate any impacts to air quality as a result of the spill on a long-term basis. We have observed odor-causing pollutants associated with oil on the shore in the Gulf region at low levels. Some people have reported headaches, eye, nose, and throat irritation, maybe even nausea. Primarily, we think from the H2S. But in terms of the other information that I mentioned from the monitors, no long-term impacts have been detected. A little bit about water sampling along the Gulf. We've been very actively involved there from our regional office, as has Region 6, as has all the others, including our states. Here's some of our main objectives: establishing pre-spill impact sediment and water quality conditions and monitoring through the impact and recovery. We've also monitored, along with NOAA and the U.S. Coast Guard, the deep water sampling. We've taken deep water samples while the dispersant was being deployed. And in our region alone, the water quality sampling efforts related to the spill include a baseline assessment at 25 stations, targeted samples at 23 other stations, 13 beaches spread across sector Mobile, as well as in Florida embayments east of Santa Rosa Sound. And what we found is very few sediment volatile organic concentrations were found that were above the method reporting limits. I think there was at least one water sample that exceeded the method reporting limit for toluene, but it was well below the NOAA screening value. And a little bit more information about what's being monitored for in those locations, and that is continuing. Now, regarding waste management and shoreline cleanup, you've seen some photographs earlier, and I have a few others about that will show you some photographs of the beach cleanup. BP early on developed a waste management plan with our input, with state input, and with local citizens' input. We followed that up as those evolved with a directive, or with directives in Region 6 and a directive in Region 4, written to ensure that BP completes its responsibilities under the waste management plans. Those were signed on June 29th. And they basically created enforceable requirements, implementation procedures, and oversight plans related to their handling of waste materials. Provided guidelines for community engagement activities, which they've done a lot of to date, as we've done a lot of to date. Requires them to give us access at any of the locations, staging areas, landfills, decon areas. Requires the submittal of waste updates and tracking systems. And a little bit now about what we're talking about when I refer to the solid waste. Some of it is just what I refer to here as regular trash. Organics like seaweed and litter that was found on the beach. The contractors have removed that so as to prevent it from being oiled. We've also, of course, had a lot of recyclables, plastic bottles and other things collected from the beach, these having no oil on them. But then oil impacted waste, sand and debris, which you've heard about already and seen photographs of, and boom, and then a few photographs of this material. The collection of the oily waste on beaches. You've seen a lot of these in the news. There's, as Commander Boudreau mentioned earlier, much less of this that is being found right now. But these are independent teams hired by BP to do the beach cleanup. They were monitored by EPA staff and are continuing to be monitored by EPA staff. A few more photographs along the way, including the one on the right, which is some of the nighttime cleanup that was taking place. And this map just shows you a few of the staging and decontamination areas within our region. You'll see that there are 11 staging areas in Region 4 as of August 9th. Staging areas, there are 5 in Alabama, 4 in Florida, 2 in Mississippi, and then 4 decontamination areas in Region 4, 1 in Alabama, 1 in Florida, and 2 in Mississippi, again as of August the 9th. Decontamination areas for decontaminating the boom primarily, as well as anything else that has oil in it that can be cleaned. One of the things I'll emphasize here is that, as I mentioned earlier, BP is making characterizations of the material that is collected. EPA is also visiting each of these staging areas and decontamination areas once per week. A little bit about the staging areas themselves. I mentioned the directive that was signed and the fact that BP is sampling each of those staging areas at least once per week. And we're visiting at least once per week ourselves. We've also sampled the oily debris, are sampling it twice per month. States are also with us on many of those inspections or site visits, and they are in some cases conducting or gathering their own samples. And important for what I'm going to show you in a moment regarding where the oil is going, the analyses by BP and by EPA do not show that the oil impacted waste is what we would define as a hazardous waste. This is just a roll-off container that has some of the bags that are filled with oily waste. Some more photographs of, again, of the roll-off containers. Within those, there are bags of the oily waste. This particular location was in Theodore, Alabama, at one of the staging areas, and this is one of the contractors, actually an EPA contractor, who was opening up one of the bags to sample that waste. A little bit about the decon areas. As I mentioned, the contractor cleans and reuses equipment if it's possible. It's not always possible, but when they can, they're trying to do that. They're capturing the wash water for reuse. We are visiting those decontamination areas once per week, and we're sampling at least twice per month. And again, those analyses don't show that that has ever been a hazardous waste. This is also this is a decon area. That's some of the boom that a worker is cleaning, and that's some of it in the bottom right-hand corner that's ready to be cleaned. And where is it going? The disposal landfills in Region 4, which include Alabama, Florida, and Mississippi. These are the landfills, solid waste landfills that are permitted to receive non-hazardous waste. And I will say that as of this week, 3 additional landfills in Mississippi have been added. 3 of those, 3 solid waste landfills have been added. They've also added into the plan the Emil hazardous waste landfill in the event that any hazardous waste is discovered, so that will be available for disposition. And this just shows the locations on the map of those solid waste landfills. Our role, as I mentioned, was through the directive and providing oversight along with our state programs, monitoring the solid waste management plan, the liquids waste and materials management plan, working with them on the waste sampling plan, the community outreach plan. And how many site sampling visits have we made? I think as of August the 9th, we had 18 site sampling visits that had been conducted. That was at staging areas, 18 at the decon areas. And again, to date, none of those materials have been found to be a hazardous waste by definition. We are, as I've mentioned to you before, one of the many agencies that are providing support to the Coast Guard in this effort. We do enjoy a very good working relationship with the Coast Guard. Unfortunately, one of the reasons we enjoy such a good working relationship is we've had an opportunity to work with them a lot on hurricane responses over the years. And that's not something that anybody enjoys, but I'm very happy to point out that we do have the opportunity to drill with the Coast Guard quite often. So the lines of communication are very, very good between our regional office and the Coast Guard. And they've continued to work well with us and we with them throughout this response. As I mentioned, we are continuing to collect samples along the shoreline and beyond for chemicals related to the oil and to dispersants in the air, water, and sediment. We will continue to do that. We ourselves are working on a transition plan similar to what was mentioned by the Coast Guard earlier. But as part of that transition plan, we will continue to be down on the Gulf, continuing to monitor, continuing to sample, continuing to analyze for oil and dispersants. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Our next speaker is going to give us a perspective from BP. Ray Dempsey is Director of Public Affairs and Government Relations and a longtime oil man with BP. Ray?
Thank you, Dan, and thank you to all of you for allowing me to be here with you this evening. I should offer special thanks to Representative Long, who I think has had to step away, and Senator Jones for the invitation to be here on behalf of BP. Also special thanks to Dr. Law and the team here at St. Petersburg College for hosting us in these wonderful facilities here on the Seminole campus. I'm very pleased to be here with you, and I'll tell you that these kinds of conversations have been a really important priority to me in the time that I have spent supporting our response here in the state of Florida for more than 100 days now. I didn't bring a PowerPoint presentation, and I'm grateful to my distinguished colleagues on the panel who have shared with you some terrific information. And I will reinforce many of the points of data and the observations that were made. But beyond the data and the information, I hope to spend some time with you here very briefly just talking a bit about the journey that we've been on over the 111 days in this response, and then give you a view of BP's commitment to the long-term recovery and support that we'll continue to provide in the state of Florida, as the work is certainly not yet done. Some of the data that you saw from Mr. Farmer, actually, I think just now, about the number of resources that have been deployed in this response match exactly with some of the notes that I was handed, so that's a good thing. There are also a few points, though, where we did see a few differences in the numbers, and frankly, I think it's a matter of the point in time at which you measure. But in particular, I know that there have been, at its peak, nearly 50,000 people who have been working tirelessly in this response. And these 50,000 people, I'll tell you, they're working 7-day-a-week schedules. They're working 12 and 14 and 16 and 18 and 20-hour days. A number of people have been working on the shorelines, on the coastlines, in conditions that you heard described by Mr. Barnett and Commander Boudreaux. And they're doing a really hard job. And I just have to say that while this response has not been perfect, there are many lessons to be learned. Some of them we'll talk about here this evening. Some of them we'll continue to draw on and learn from and apply. I am personally very grateful for the extraordinary commitment, as Commander Boudreaux mentioned, the extraordinary sacrifice and determination that's been shown by the folks that have come together in a spirit of terrific cooperation to address what has been a terrible tragedy and a terrific crisis for this region and for our nation. There's been, I think, more than 6,000 vessels that have been on the water. I think Mr. Farmer showed a number of over 5,000, and that's a pretty close alignment. There certainly has been millions of feet of boom deployed around the region. There have been aircraft, airplanes, and helicopters that have been part of the support. And all of this has been within the context of a terrific sense of cooperation in this unified command structure. The U.S. Coast Guard as the federal on-scene lead, and retired Admiral Thad Allen as the National Incident Commander is clearly the final authority and the ultimate decision maker in all facets of this response. But we've worked really closely with the Coast Guard along with the state's Department of Environmental Protection, the EPA, state departments of Interior, Department of Interior and other state federal agencies to put together what has been an unprecedented response. And as it should be, as this has been an unprecedented oil spill of proportions that we haven't seen. I want to talk a little bit about what has been the priority in Florida. And you heard a description from Commander Boudreaux of the efforts that have been put forth in the Panhandle, primarily under the direction of the Mobile Unified Command there. When I joined this effort in early May, I came here to St. Petersburg and was part of the St. Petersburg Unified Command team. We were based actually just not very far away at the Fish and Wildlife Research Institute. And I lived there for a little more than a month, actually, working very closely with the U.S. Coast Guard team and the State Department of Environmental Protection team. Our priority was really clear. On the peninsula, there has been very gratefully, very little in the way of any direct oil impact. In fact, in the peninsula, there's been no oil impact that's been shown to be associated with the Deepwater Horizon incident. But nevertheless, we worked really hard on the planning and the preparation for what we should do for the county, starting in Taylor County in the north here on the west coast, down to Collier County, and then around through the Keys, Monroe County, and down ultimately to Miami. We wanted to be sure that we worked closely with the counties to bring in their expertise and their insight into their appropriate protective strategies for their coastlines, as they know their coastlines best. The area contingency plans that you heard described were a central feature to that planning and preparation. And when we arrived, it was clear that the area contingency plans probably weren't quite ready. They weren't quite robust enough to help us be prepared for an incident of this scale. So we invited in the emergency operations teams from each of the counties along this west coast to do some workshops here in the St. Petersburg area to work through their area contingency plans and to ensure that there was alignment, there was clarity as to what was the right way to plan for and to protect the coastline along this west coast. It was also important that we maintain open lines of communication. And while I may not have spoken to very many of you who are here tonight, I will tell you that I've spoken to an awful lot of people, certainly along the West Coast and around the state of Florida. And in my role as the lead external affairs representative for BP for the state of Florida, I've spent a lot of time now from when we were initially based here in St. Petersburg to the time that we moved over in early June to Miami to establish the Florida Peninsula Command Post with the Coast Guard and with the state and with the Department of Interior. I've spent time in Tallahassee working with the state level government officials and my team there. I've spent time in the Panhandle trying to provide some support to the team there that's been much more on the front lines in terms of the oil impact. But along the way, I visited people in the communities. I spent time with local elected officials along the coast. I spent time with business leaders and in community forums, much like this, mostly to listen, mostly to understand your concerns and your priorities about what mattered most for your part of the state of Florida, your part of the region, the Gulf Coast, as it related to this oil spill, and to make sure that I could take back those thoughts, those concerns, and those ideas and integrate them into the planning and the preparation that we had underway for the response. The communication won't end, and as I mentioned a few moments ago, I want to reinforce to you that while the flow of the well has stopped very, very gladly on the 15th of July, so more than a month now, there's been no oil flowing from the well. The job is not done. And BP is now very much in the midst of some preparation for some very long-term support and recovery for the Gulf Coast region and even specifically here in the state of Florida. I'd like to spend just a few more minutes now before I get pulled away on, so what does that long-term recovery, what does that long-term support really mean? And there are a number of dimensions of the support that we've already started to work on. Many of them I hope you'll recognize, and that will become part of your expectations of what BP will continue to do for some time to come. You've heard from Commander Boudreaux and from Mr. Barnett that there are indeed still some incidents of tar balls in the Panhandle. So very importantly, in support of the state of Florida, we'll continue to have resources available and deployed to address those tar balls whenever they occur and wherever they occur along the Florida coastline. A big issue for the state of Florida, we recognize, is related to the impact on the tourism industry. I understand that's a $60 to $65 billion a year industry. I've spent a lot of time working with people involved in the tourism industry from around the state, and even earlier this week I spent some time with the CEO of Visit Florida. I spent lots of time in discussions with the heads of the county tourism development councils and the heads of the local teams that are working to provide promotional support for tourism industry. But unfortunately, there certainly has been impact to the tourism industry in the state, largely as a function of the perception that there's oil in many more areas of Florida than indeed has been the case. And so the claims process has become a really important part of our continued support for this. And the claims process, from a standing start in early May now, I guess it is, has paid out some $370 million around the region. About $40 million of that has been paid to Floridians, and it won't stop. And indeed, on Monday, the 23rd, officially I think it's at 12:01 a.m. on Monday the 23rd, the independent administrator, Mr. Ken Feinberg, takes on full responsibility for the administration of effectively the $20 billion escrow fund that BP established some time ago, and managing the claims process for individuals and businesses that may continue to be impacted economically by the implications of this spill. We think it's really important, quite frankly, that Mr. Feinberg and his team have the opportunity to administer and manage this claims process in a way that's very independent from BP. Some of the questions, some of the challenges, some of the interpretations of what are reasonable claims, what is compensable, I think it's better and it's wiser for BP ultimately not to be the arbiter on those kinds of questions, and for there to be a really accomplished and competent and professional independent administrator. And Mr. Feinberg comes with a tremendous background and a terrific set of experiences. He led the claims process in the post 9/11 context, so brings with him some very real and valuable experiences in dealing with some extraordinary crises. And so we can look forward to his acceleration of the claims process, as you may have heard him describe in hearings and in town hall meetings around the region. And I think that's going to be a great boost to our commitment to continue to provide support and to put money back into the hands of people who ought to have it. We're going to continue the assessment of the long-term implications, the ecological, environmental implications of this spill. And I think it was terrific the way that Mr. Farmer spoke about this earlier, because there has indeed been an awful lot of attention paid recently to different scientific opinions and assessments of what those implications, what those issues are. And while I used to be an engineer, I am one by background, I'm not nearly qualified to give you a scientific interpretation of what really will be the long-term implications. But I think it's critically important that the experts that we've worked with through this response at NOAA, the experts that have been brought to bear through the various state and federal agencies, and indeed the academic community, including USF and others right here in the state of Florida, work together to be clear in both the research processes, the analysis and the evaluation then of what the implications are over time. I've met personally with Dean Bill Hogarth from USF on several occasions now, and I know that they have a team of really terrific, competent, scientific experts, and they were the recipients, in fact, along with their cooperation with the Florida Institute of Oceanography, FIO, of one of the advanced grants $10 million advance grant to do some of the long-term research that we've committed to on the heels of this incident. Indeed, we've committed $500 million towards a long-term Gulf Coast or Gulf of Mexico research program to make sure we get to the understanding of what does matter, what are the implications of the dispersant use, what are the implications of the dissolved hydrocarbons in the water over time, what are the implications for the wildlife and the food chain. And I'll assure you that we in BP want, as much as anybody else, to know the answers to those questions and to be prepared to make the right choices and make the right interventions to preserve this really critical and valuable ecosystem that we enjoy here, I know, in Florida and around the region. Just a few more points then. We'll certainly want to continue the communication. Myself and my colleagues will continue to participate in fora like this one, to share with you what we've learned, what we understand, to listen to your concerns and your questions, and to make that part of the ongoing recovery process. And then a few more points I better make that you may have read about in just the last few days. On Monday, we made an announcement of a commitment of $52 million towards behavioral health around the region, because we understand that while there have been environmental impacts and there certainly have been economic impacts, we can't afford to miss the potential risks and implications associated with behavioral health. In the state of Florida, there will be a $3 million grant made to the Department of Children and Family Services, and we're very pleased to be able to provide that support in the state of Florida. Florida will also enjoy a portion of a $10 million grant provided at a federal level to SAMHSA, so I think that's great progress. I also want to remind you that we just, a couple of weeks ago now, we made a commitment to some additional tourism support in the Panhandle. We committed an additional $7 million on top of the $25 million grant that we made earlier in this response. And that was because we recognize the impact, especially in the Panhandle where there's been direct oil impact, is critical, and it's the time is of the essence. I know that the counties, the 7 counties that were part of the consortium that worked with us to come to that solution, did a terrific job in understanding who their customers are, what they needed to do, and what time frame within which they needed to work. They came back to us with the recommendation of the right way to allocate and distribute that $7 million, where it needed to go and what it needed to do to provide support. I hope many of you have seen some of the promotions that have come as a result of that grant, and I'm as hopeful, I know, as we all are across the state, that it begins to have the impact that we're looking for, and that is the catchphrase we've all kind of taken on in this response. We want to see heads in beds in the state of Florida and create a recovery in the tourism area. So just a last quick point. I know it's one of the objectives of this discussion tonight, and we probably won't get to all the answers, but there's a really important thing, which is what are the lessons that we've learned? And I better start with just an observation about so what happened on the night of April 20th and then April 22nd when the Deepwater Horizon ultimately sank. And the honest truth is we don't yet know. There are multiple investigations underway, one led by BP, several others led by the federal government and others to get to that answer and to be very clear about so what really did happen. What I do know and what I believe with great confidence is that we will learn some lessons. We will make changes, dramatic changes, I think, in the way that we go about deep water exploration and production to ensure that what happened in this Deepwater Horizon can't happen again. And that is something that is just critically urgent and matters a lot to all of us around the Gulf Coast, all of us in the industry, and I know all of you here in the state of Florida. A second lesson then that I'd kind of reinforce, because you've heard it spoken about already by my fellow panelists, is this point about cooperation and coordination. There can't be enough cooperation and coordination with parties and stakeholders at every level in a response of this kind of a magnitude. And one of the things that I think matters an awful lot is our ability to commit the time and the energy and to have the capacity to listen well to the people on the ground, in the cities, in the counties, in the local areas that know best their shorelines, that know best the ecosystems, that know best the resources that are available to help support the fight and the response and the recovery. And we've done that, and I think one of the lessons we've learned is we probably didn't do it early enough and probably didn't do it enough throughout, and we're going to continue to learn from that. We're going to continue to reinforce and grow in that commitment to listen and to engage on a local level throughout the long-term recovery. The cooperation and coordination and the spirit, as I mentioned earlier, between those of us who have worked inside Unified Command has been outstanding. And I've got nothing but just terrific appreciation and support for my colleagues that have been part of Unified Command working in U.S. Coast Guard and in the state and in other federal agencies. But I'll tell you that we probably learned lessons about how in a response of this scale, there are some things that we need to do better between us as well. There's some clarity that we probably need to fine-tune around decision-making processes to make us move more quickly, to make us more nimble, and to make us more able to respond to the concerns and priorities that we hear coming from each of you in the communities. And I know that's a commitment that we've made in BP, and it's a commitment that I know we'll make and take away and share from the Unified Command process as a result of the incident. That's all I want to share with you now. I am looking forward, though, to speaking more with you and trying to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Our next speaker will be Neil Brown, editor of the St. Petersburg Times, to talk to us about response and responsibility of the media. Neil?
Thank you. Good evening. And again, I join my fellow panelists in thanking all of you who put this panel together in helping us have a conversation out in the open. As Mr. Dempsey said, I think communication is just a great opportunity for us to understand what's been going on. I want to tell you a little bit about a couple of conversations I had with two readers of the St. Pete Times in the last couple of days. One was last Friday, and then one was on Sunday. Before I get to some slides I want to show you. One was a woman, longtime reader, I think she lives in Tarpon Springs, and she had called up about, I actually think she called up because she hadn't gotten her paper, and it got forwarded up to me, and which is okay. And I'm glad that she wanted her paper. I'm very glad for that. And she said, you know, I know, it was something along these lines, I didn't write it down, but it was something like, I know the oil spill, it's not gushing anymore, but I'm still just sick about it, which is a phrase I heard over and over from people. I'm just sick about it. And so she kind of implored us to keep the coverage going, which I assured her we would. That was on Friday. Then on Sunday, I was playing tennis with a friend of mine who's a very good reader of the paper, and he said, well, it looks like the oil spill is going to turn out to be the great non-story of 2010. But I understood his point. It wasn't a political point he wasn't making. It was now that it's capped, things subside, the attention of the American public, all of us, kind of moves on to other things, and so we have to grapple with that as we put out our paper on our website. People are just sick about it. People think, well, maybe we're done. There are two, I want to share with you two very, maybe not two, one very well-known quote about journalism, and then maybe one not so well-known. The first quote about journalism, and I'm going to give you a little taste of it here. We don't know who uttered this, but it's uttered all the time, which is that journalism is the first rough draft of history. Maybe some of you have heard that. And every day as we take these snapshots, it adds up to a rough draft of history. I like that. There's also a less well-known quote from the noted journalistic philosopher Dave Barry. Dave once wrote, we journalists are extremely impressed with scientists, and we will frankly print just about any wacky thing they tell us. And that's a little bit of the dynamic we have as we try to cover a story that is as complex and unanticipated as this oil spill. But I thought it'd be useful to give you a little bit of I put together a fairly quick slideshow that would, I would say, maybe the first rough draft of this story, just as you saw it in the pages of the St. Pete Times and some other places as well. I hope I got this right. So one point I want to make on this very first two slides. When the explosion happened, it was actually not even a story on the front page. It's a picture, but there's no story. Let's see if this gets me there. That's, of course, the picture. And then the story actually was on page 2 of the paper, off to the side, because 11 missing. It was terrible. But like so many things that happen in the sort of chapters that we have to kind of cover them, we didn't really know what was going on. And so it hadn't really registered. Now, from the next day on, it was on the front page of our paper pretty much nonstop for 2 solid months. And these are obviously some of the images, powerful images, going forward. So the first chapter for us of this story is, in a sense, a breaking news chapter, where we're all trying to sort out what's happening. We're trying to just kind of give you as much information as we can. This is, we're always looking for the human angle and toll. These are some survivors from the explosion. It's an emotional story. You want to take it beyond science right away. But again, these are things just sort of unfolding. And everything I'm showing you, by the way, I'm showing you in chronological order as it happened. These were some some families. Also, somebody just found out that a relative was okay. Of course, on any big story like this one, and of course oil drilling has been an interesting and important topic for the St. Pete Times and for all of us, I'm sure, in this audience, we're constantly obviously trying to apply it to Florida to the best that we can. This was right in between. It's in the middle of the Gulf. That's important to us. But obviously we knew that it was going to have impact on Florida. One of our important obligations and responsibilities is, in fact, to try to break things down graphically for you, try to make it accessible. So we tried very hard. We worked with the Miami Herald, our own art staff, others, to try to locate where things were, try to put it in perspective. A number of my colleagues on the panel here have had maps similar to this one, and also talk about what was at risk. Immediately, the news, I shouldn't say immediately, after you get sort of past the breaking thing very quickly, I should say, there's always, of course, interest in responsibility, who's to blame, how's it going. This story had this odd dynamic. We have a news meeting every day at 3 o'clock to talk about what's going to go on the front page of the paper. And every day there was this sort of sense among the journalists at the Times that, well, maybe today's they're going to plug it. Maybe it was kind of hard to think that this was going to go on, you know, on and on and on. We obviously wanted to learn more about BP, which and there's a water story we used to find out a history there, and it's bringing some understanding to a company that maybe most people didn't know very much about. Of course, quickly in a story like this, it starts playing out in the editorial pages and columns, and the government's response obviously comes under scrutiny. The governor, of course, got involved, and it became a point where this was almost his entire focus for some time. And as we had opportunities to go up in the air and see the site and see what was happening ourselves, we would continue to do that. A lot of what we do, for better or worse, I'm sure you have questions about it, has to, and the nature of the story has to be a little bit speculative. And so we tried to understand whether seafood in particular was going to be affected. So you see that story. And then, again, back to the graphics. The efforts to plug the leak were sort of, it was part of the shared experience, and that's an important point about this story, is there's quite a shared experience. And the box, the dome, the language, people started talking about things that were very technical, and we tried hard to help them with some presentations that were a little different. Obviously, still sources of the explosion to be worked out. This was a moment where there had been a source attributed to it. We get a lot of letters like this one that said, please don't let us forget this disaster. And of course, stories become very political, and people had feelings about it in all directions. But we've got an enormous amount of letters to us in contact from our readers about coverage and questions. All the while, this was a picture that appeared in the paper. I found the picture before I was able to get the page. This was, while this was going on, I don't know what I've got the date on this. This must have been in early May. This is our St. Pete Beach, right by the Don. Tourism was okay at that point. The beaches were still clean and are. We have a political website called PolitiFact. As more and more politicians became focused on the story, and not just politicians, pundits, a lot of facts get thrown around. We tried to use our political fact-checking operation to check the claims going forward, because it became most people talking about this became very impassioned about it. Some more documentary photos that we published and others. Relatively early on, again, as we try to understand the science and the weather and all the factors that could affect it, we had a front page story and then this graphic that talked about the possibility, again back to that speculating a little bit, that Florida might catch a break with the loop current, and to some great degree, obviously, that came to pass. Help people understand. Again, more pictures, keep in mind, were the eyes and ears, certainly television, the internet. We try to make sense of it for folks, but it's a gripping and visual story. We started certainly to get wind, as you all did, that there was a perception issue as much as anything. Again, there's somebody vacationing, having a great time on the beaches here, but it was starting to affect local business, local tourism. This is an extraordinary photo that'll be one of those for the year in review. This is actually in, I think it's in Alabama. It's a phenomenon that we've all experienced this year. Obviously, the environmental impact was something that, again, is where we would hear from a lot of folks about it. I'm just sick about it, and there's something that can be done. Also a bird and oil. As the response continued to get focused and progress was made, we tried to focus on some of the personalities who were leading the efforts. Show some of the people out there working, some of the equipment that you've heard tonight has been used to such great effect. Obviously, the political chapter of the story is ongoing. Mr. Hayward's appearance and the focus on him, understandably, as people sought accountability. Kind of a photo of our time. This was a guy who had grown up on and learned how to swim on the beaches up near Pensacola when oil first started to show up on that beach. And he had learned how to swim. He had taught his son how to swim, and he had gone out that day, and there it was. It's an emotional story, certainly, for all of us. You saw some earlier some pictures of cleanup, and we also tried to document that. The efforts were really extraordinary. You've seen and heard from my fellow panelists the numbers of people involved, and it's an enormous undertaking, and we tried to convey that. One of the things we heard from folks was we just get calls all the time with people with their own ideas, how they could help. Could we try this? Could we get the word to BP? How, if they would only do this, and we tried to bring some order to that, to the interest that everybody had. Again, more graphics to try to show as the efforts advanced. Our job, obviously, is to try to make this accessible to non-scientists, to non-environmentalists, to the folks who are reading about the work that was underway, and we tried to do that graphically. We tried to keep up with when things were going okay business-wise and let people know that. And then, of course, when there was success, we tried to, again, cover that chapter of the story. Again, I sort of see these things in chapters as they continue to evolve. Another picture of the oil. Interesting graphics, and you go to YouTube, and you could sort of, people could engage in this story more than many that we've seen in some time, and I think that's overall. Even, obviously, a lot of it's technical, a lot of it's not easily understood, but it allows people to participate in their own way. Now the report's come out, obviously, and we're trying to make sense of that. One of my colleagues, I think, mentioned the battle of the scientists is underway. It's understandable, and we're trying to do the best we can in reporting on that. This past weekend, famous tourist showed up. That was the kind of thing I think we may see more of. This was yesterday's paper, as we had an interview with Thad Allen and talked again about how to go forward, as a number of the panelists have suggested, in trying to understand what is really hard to understand something that's still uncertain right now. As well as we did an important Q&A on as the shrimping industry returned to business, and that talked about how there's going to be so much more testing on seafood, and that so far things look actually pretty good and pretty clean. So that's back to the beginning. There's sort of 3 points I want to make, and then I know you want to get to some questions, so let me try that. First of all, from our standpoint, I must tell you, the demand and the interest in this story was unlike anything we had seen in some time. That may be an obvious statement, but in a world where there's so much going on, the amount of calls, letters, and interest that we had in this story was really extraordinary, and continues to be so, even as we try to sort some of these things out. We printed some 400 stories in the now 4 months since the spill, and it dominated the front pages more than I ever would have imagined that it would. And I think part of it is our job, as I tried to explain, is to, in a sense, give you that first rough draft of history. But it's also, there is a shared experience going on here, no matter what people think, if things are done too little, too much, and that people connected with the story and wanted to participate, even from afar. And it seemed to hit an emotional chord with our audience in ways that we hadn't seen. Our lead reporter, Craig Pittman, says he's never gotten as much response on anything he's covered in more than a dozen years of environmental reporting than this. Maybe that's not surprising. He also, and this is a part of our dynamic these days, found more connection with people through, including officials at BP and the government, through Twitter and Facebook. And so social media, again, began to play much more of a part in connecting our audience, and maybe why it was such a shared experience. So from our standpoint, this was something to be on top of, and that there was a connection with the audience that was something we hadn't seen, certainly in a long time. It dovetails into my second point, which is it's also an extremely difficult story for us to cover, and to cover well. First of all, like for everybody up here, you know, we have plans every year for hurricane season. We have plans every year for covering the election or elections. We got obituaries written in advance for when important people may die. Certainly oil drilling, we've covered some of that in the past. It's a politically controversial issue, particularly off the coast of Florida. But we couldn't anticipate that this would happen. Nobody could. And like everybody involved, had to sort of spring into action. And so as a result, your response, even as reporters, editors, photographers, is evolving every day, you know, almost making it up as you go along, hoping it sort of adds up to something. And so you're going to get a few things wrong early on, and hopefully you get a lot of it right. But it's a tricky one. For us, the degree of difficulty was also high, as I'm sure, again, it is for a number of the folks up here, too, in that you can't see it. It's dark, it's far away. From our standpoint, we can't hardly get close. We've had conversations throughout the process of since the explosion about getting journalists closer. At some point, we were pushed back, and we had a hard time getting toward it. We're now back where we're getting greater access. But, of course, ultimately, it's at the bottom of the sea, and it's very hard to see, to understand, and that just makes it a difficult story to cover. What's more, as you've heard tonight, and we all appreciate the expertise in this room, which is enormous, It's very technical and not easily understood. Not easily understood by the journalists, and certainly not easily understood by the audience. And so it just becomes hard to sort things out. We don't have a lot of scientists on the staff, and in fact, science reporting in general has kind of been diminished over the years as newsrooms have had to cut back in resource. I'm not sure it would make any difference because you don't know what the particular expertise that you're going to need is going to be, but it's just been a very difficult story to cover. The third thing, and it kind of goes with the difficulty, is this: as we go forward, it's a challenge to cover something where the outcome is so uncertain. You saw it in today's dueling scientific report stories. We don't know yet what's going to happen. We don't know yet who's right in all the different reports. I know extremely bright people are working on these questions, and as I think one of you said a little while ago, if we can start to come together and work, if they can work together so that we can get some kind of consensus, particularly an independent consensus, then I think it'll be a little bit easier to cover going forward. But right now, with a tip of the hat to Dave Barry, it's very hard to know the credibility of any scientific report. I think we know the credibility of the individuals, and that's important, and it's all pretty high, frankly. But there's going to be dueling opinions, and sorting that out going forward is key. So there's a great uncertainty that makes it difficult to go forward, though we don't have any intention to shy away from that. Our conversations about coverage in the future is going to be very much consumer-oriented, as claims need to be made, as the continued campaign to beat back perceptions that the oil spill is a bigger impact here in the Tampa Bay area than it may be, than it is, versus Pensacola. We'll continue to work on our coverage of that. We very much believe that as the political debate continues to take off, we need to help people sort that out, and that our number one responsibility is an independent sorting out of truth from rumor and laying our information and our sources open for all of you to make your own judgments. So we're trying to give our audience the power to understand the story, whether they think it's overblown or they're sick about it, to at least understand what's going on. And we think in that way we can provide a pretty good service. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Neil. And what a great job from all of our panelists. Our next segment is going to be questions and answers for all panelists, and that will be moderated by our colleague, Susan Glickman. Susan?
Thank you. Very good. Very interesting range of perspectives, and I understand that Director Barnett and Commander Boudreau are there. We saw them on the camera just a minute ago. So first off, I wanted to just mention that the whole idea of this series is that we're looking at sort of what was going on with the oil spill, and it is amazing how different things were just a few short weeks ago, July 14th, compared to sort of where we are and where the conversation is today. And the next section, the next series is about the solutions. So we talked a little bit about lessons learned, and I think there's a lot of people in this room and people who were here at the last event that really are looking to the solution so that we don't have another oil spill like this again. So we're going to hold off for this purposes a lot of those questions. In fact, last time we probably got, a third of our questions were about, why weren't we doing more to move to clean energy? So we're going to put that a little bit to the side just for everyone know that we're going to concentrate on that. Now, if you have a question, if you would send them up, Carol is walking around and grabbing those. So what we are doing now is we had some questions that came up on the first panel, some that didn't fit the evening's panelists. A lot of things clearly were questions for BP, of course, because you all are in the hot seat a little bit here, or quite a bit, actually. And then some are even a little bit irrelevant now. So I've tried to sort of pull together some of those questions. And let's kind of start out with this whole issue of the amount of oil that's out there. And I think there's a lot of mistrust, because as that happened, Neil, you did a really terrific job sort of running through the chronology, and this story has changed and shifted pretty rapidly for all of us that are watching this closely. Talk about the amount of oil out there, Ray, and this idea, and I think Commander Boudreau, you probably, as well as Director Barnett, it appeared to a lot of people that the amount of oil was being downplayed. A lot of people talked about the relationship between fines that BP were going to have to encounter related to how much oil was out there, and I think maybe sort of a general mistrust. And then if you would, Ray, you in particular, talk a little bit about where does that lead us to the regulation of the oil industry and some of the initiatives that Congress is undertaking. But talk about the amount of oil and that perception or reality.
Yeah, I'm happy to, and I certainly will invite Commander Boudreau and Director Barnett to add their thoughts. I think I should start just by reinforcing that, frankly, it's as important to BP. We share the understanding and the sort of priority in having a clear understanding of how much oil came out of that well. And while I appreciate the concerns and the perceptions that have come out that there were intentional downplaying, if you will, of the amount of oil, from where I have sat and from my role in the company and from my role within the unified command structure, my belief is that's just not the case. From very early on, it was really, really difficult to come up with the right answer. And from just a few weeks into the response, the accountability for the estimates of the oil flow actually shifted to a task force, an oil flow working group that was put into place by the National Incident Commander. So from very early on, BP provided some data. We certainly provided the imagery that all of us came to know and get tired of. And it was really important in terms of trying to structure the technical estimations of the amount of oil coming out. My view is that some of the best and smartest technical experts in the world were a part of this team, this independent working team, not under the direction of BP by any means. And the fact that the estimates evolved from early numbers of 5,000 barrels a day up to the 35 to 60,000 barrels a day near the end of the flow, I think is just an indication of how hard it was to come up with exactly the right answer. At 5,000 feet of water depth, the ability to apply instrumentation, to apply more manual approaches to metering and measurement were just not practical. And the access to information was fairly limited to all of us involved, to the imagery of what was coming out at the well and to the implications of what was appearing on the surface. So I think it's also really important to reinforce that the estimates of the amount of oil coming out were really not the accountability of BP, and the media reports that you read and that you saw were of estimates that were coming from an independent group of experts that were appointed by the National Incident Commander. So as it relates to the longer-term legislative concerns, I don't think I have the expertise to venture into that space. I think it's a really important issue for the state of Florida. It's a really important issue for the federal government, and I'm certain that lessons will be learned that will shape the way we would respond to this sort of thing in the future.
Commander Boudreau, did you want to respond to that in terms of the estimates? And
Well, the estimate numbers that I've seen was 4.9 million barrels of oil, and that was just an estimate. It's pretty difficult to determine the actual exact amount of oil that was lost from the well. And as far as the legislation and changing the structure or the framework for the response in the future, I know that'll be looked at by Congress. I really can't comment on that right now. That'll be a long, drawn-out debate on the way that the Oil Pollution Act will be amended in the future.
well, and part of the point I was trying to make is as the spill was evolving, I know we were getting new developments by people like Ian McDonald from Florida State University, was coined the McDonald factor, because he was reporting that the oil being released was far greater than was being reported at the time. So part of the problem is that creates this whole area of mistrust. And I think people really look at BP and the way the oil industry has been regulated. And if you don't want to comment necessarily on sort of what Congress is doing doing precisely, but that relationship between the funding of the oil industry that has given in the billions of dollars over the last decade and political contributions and how the oil industry is regulated. Do you sort of, I mean, that comment makes more sense to go to you, Ray, if you have any comments on that.
I'm happy to try. I do believe that there are some other perspectives into this that are valid and valuable here. So there's no question that there is an obligation on the part of the federal government and states to provide the framework within which our industry operates. And it's clear that there are some lessons to be learned from the state of that regulatory relationship that was kind of brought into light and illustrated by this incident and some of the challenges that we've seen along the way of the response. I don't know what wasn't quite right, and I couldn't tell you from my own personal work experience what's really very good, because my day job is not in the deep water exploration and production part of this business. In fact, my day job is as the head of strategy and capital investments in the refining and marketing part of our business here in the United States. So I wish I had more to offer you in terms of what really are the issues and the implications related to the relationships between the industry and the regulators, but I can't offer you that. I do have a confidence that just as is true with the causes of the incident, so true are there lessons to be learned and adjustments that will be made in that regulatory space.
And can you, everyone at this high level always has very specific expertise, so it sometimes is difficult. So Alan, I know that your expertise is particularly about in the waste management side of what we're doing with the tar balls and all of that. So I do want to ask you about that, but before we do, I think that part of the concerns of the public is when they do hear these dueling reports, as others have referred to. So the administration comes out with a report that says 75% of the oil is gone, and then Georgia Tech comes out with a report that says 75% of the oil is still there. And then the University of South Florida with their Weatherbird ship have just come back, and they're talking about finding oil in critical marine life in the phytoplankton and in this vital underwater canyon about 40 miles southeast of Panama City. Can you talk a little bit maybe about some of the process, and I think Director Barnett, you as well, about how these reports come out, and it is very disconcerting to the public to get such different information?
Well, one thing I would say is that we welcome those reports coming out. The fact is some of those reports have just come out in the last few days, so they're being looked at right now in our EPA headquarters office and in the States, also I'm sure at BP and elsewhere. So the point is there's still a lot of research that's going on.
Director Barnett, did you want to speak to that?
Yes, ma'am. Give me 1 minute. We have an echo coming back off the feed here. I completely agree, and one of the things that I feel is that it's healthy debate among the scientists. What I think that needs to be corrected is these early preliminary responses coming out that creates a lot of fear in our community as to what's potentially out there. I think it's healthy. I think we need to know what's going on, and they need to debate it among the scientists. It's not unusual for scientists to disagree, but I think we need to really rest on good, solid facts before this stuff is vetted out. I'm not a scientist. I'm a law enforcement officer, and we make our criminal cases on solid facts and probable cause. So that's the only way I know how to think, and I think that needs to be applied to this situation as well.
So let's talk a little bit about the issue that comes up a lot, which is this issue of the dispersants. And we've read from reports that Corexit, and someone from the audience also pointed this out, has been banned in Europe. And we'll give you a little hard time, Director Barnett, when you said that Corexit or the dispersants were mainly detergents. So there's a lot of other chemicals, petroleum distillates and propylene glycol and a number of other sort of toxic chemicals that are involved in the dispersants. So can you talk a little bit about how that decision was made, Ray? And I think, Alan, you might know a little bit about that as well. How did that go between BP and why were we using this Corexit when it is banned in Europe, or it was reported that it's banned in Europe? If you could talk a little bit about the impacts of that.
Who should go first?
Well, I don't know. Alan, do you want to speak to that? I mean, I think we're interested in how a decision like that gets made.
So I think it's an important thing to start at the sort of the decision-making framework for the use of dispersants. And throughout this response, the use of dispersants have been ultimately the decision of the unified command, not any single entity, not any individual part of the team, but through the unified command, and then ultimately by decision of the National Incident Commander. And I say that because there are a lot of choices and a lot of trade-offs to be made in making judgments about the use and the application of dispersant. I believe that the dispersant that was used here, the core exit, was indeed one that was approved by our U.S. federal government and by EPA for its use. And there were a number of tests as part of the approval process to ensure that it was something that was fit for purpose in this type of a response. The amount of dispersant to be applied was the subject of a daily decision-making process through Unified Command, and then ultimately by the Federal On-Scene Commander at Unified Area Command, first in Robert, Louisiana, and now in New Orleans, Louisiana. And so I think there's been extraordinary amount of care, diligence, and consideration being given to what is the right trade-off between the amount of dispersant that we might apply that'll allow the oil to be broken down versus the risks and the implications of seeing oil cause the impact and the harm that it can on the shoreline. So I'm not a toxicologist myself, and it would be inappropriate to try to offer a technical or a scientific view of the implications of the dispersant. But I believe that at least the decision framework through which it was used in this response, I hope I've made clear in that answer.
Alan?
Yes, I would agree with what Ray said concerning the decisions that had to be made. One of the things that our administrator made very clear in her testimony was that dispersant should be part of one of the tools in the toolbox. Shouldn't be the first choice. In situ burning and skimming certainly were higher priorities to be used before dispersants. Unfortunately, there were conditions due to the weather, chiefly, where in situ burning and skimming just wasn't possible, wasn't working. And so a decision had to be made that dispersants would be used to try and protect the valuable marshlands and keep the oil from appearing on the beaches and in the marshlands.
What are some of the world's leading marine scientists imploring you to stop using them?
So to talk a little bit about, is there anything else, Commander Boudreau or Director Barnett, did you want to add anything on the issue of dispersants?
No, ma'am, I don't feel I'm qualified to respond about dispersants.
Great. Okay, very good. Well then, Alan, if you wouldn't mind continuing a little bit, because your expertise really is in it's waste management. So a lot of people are interested in the tar balls and what are the long-term impacts if they show up on the beaches, the panhandle beaches, or if somehow it makes its way down this way in terms of for wildlife, for people. Is that something that someone could pick up or not, or do they have to avoid touching it?
No, we've advised people not to touch it when they're found on the beaches or anywhere else. We've publicized the numbers, as have the local governments and the state governments, numbers to call so that folks with the expertise and the proper protective clothing can come out and pick up those tar balls and remove them. So we don't advise anybody to do that themselves, but we do welcome the calls when they're found.
And what are the long-term impacts of the waste product in these landfills? What happens to the groundwater? There's one landfill in Florida, so up in Jackson County in the Panhandle. What are there concerns for those communities, and what would those concerns be, particularly around drinking water?
Well, all of the landfills that are being used and all of the landfills that are permitted by our state programs, who are fully authorized to do that and fully approved to site solid waste landfills, are built so that as to protect the groundwater from being impacted from anything that's placed into those landfills.
Is that a liner, or
they do have a liner. They have at a minimum 2 feet of clay liner. They have synthetic liners in addition to that. They have leachate collection systems. They have groundwater monitoring in the event that there are leaks from any of those liners. All of the landfills have financial assurance for closure and post-closure well into the future, including.
And is that something that BP bears the financial responsibility for long-term impacts, Or where does that?
The long-term impacts at the landfills themselves?
Yeah, of just storing the waste.
I hadn't really thought about the impacts for BP on the landfills in terms of the 30 years out, for example, if the landfill closes, but the waste is there, and some of it came from BP, from the oil. They're relatively small quantities when you look at the quantities of waste that are taken to those landfills. It's generally around 7% on a daily basis, at most. 7 to 8% is oily waste.
So I'm going to jump back a little bit in a chronological order because I've just been handed a whole stack of questions. So someone's asking, actually, Councilman Bill Smith from Indian Shores is asking the question about the early criticism. So Director Barnett and Commander Boudreau, if you could talk a little bit about that sort of early criticism about the slowness in the response of skimmers and so forth. Was that, was the slowness dealing with suspending the Jones Act a factor at all?
Well, first, let me say, all right, we all set?
Yeah, you're on. We can hear you.
With the slowness, our oil spill preparation was always based on what we call the most probable discharge. And when the area contingencies plans were put together, what was thought of would be an oil spill from like an oil tanker or a storage tank on land. No one ever considered a release from an oil well to go, unchecked for such a long period of time. So this was something much larger than anybody ever envisioned. So to get the equipment was brought from all over the country, all over the world. I think the Jones Act issue is a little misunderstood. Out at the well site, there were skimmers from all over the world. The Jones Act was actually not an issue at all out at the well site. And I don't know of any inland areas where the Jones Act actually came into play either. Jones Act prevents foreign ships from coming in and working on a coastal route, going from a U.S. port to a U.S. port. And offshore skimmers really weren't doing that. And the nearshore, the inshore skimmers, most of those were very small vessels, and they were U.S. flagged. So I don't know of any real Jones Act issues that were, came into effect here.
Director Barnett, did you want to add anything to that? Okay, I guess not. So let's switch a little bit back to this issue of the cleanup. So a couple people have asked about this issue of microbes, that, microbes have been used for quite some time and successfully in the 1990 spill. Was that used fully? And I imagine it was used to some extent. But could someone speak to the use of microbes in the Gulf in terms of cleaning up?
I don't have that.
Any microbe experts? Because I know that has come into play in these sort of dueling reports that the first NOAA report talked about a certain percentage. I don't remember what the number was, but a certain percentage had been sort of consumed by the bacteria. So no experts on that. So Neil, would you sort of talk a little bit about this mixed message issue? So I've got someone asking a question about what would I tell my out-of-state clients who are honestly asking how the spill has affected our beaches, and how do you at the same time sort of continue to cover it? And congratulations, Craig Pittman, of course, is an extraordinary reporter, has done a great job as always. But how do you balance, Craig's finding out the facts without being sort of alarmist and scaring tourists off of our beaches, for instance, in Tampa Bay?
Yeah, can you hear me all right? It's a constant balancing act, and that's exactly the word. We struggle with, we get information, and we want you to know it, because frankly we get as many complaints about people saying, why did you keep that from us, as why did you tell us that might be bad news. We try not to be alarmist. Mm-hmm. We try hard to not offer up information that we just don't know to be true. So the way we try to approach it is to be as specific as possible. So whether you carve that up by a geography, by a specific beach, by a specific individual's experience, we try hard, to great success sometimes not so much, to what we say, show, don't tell. Let people talk about their own experiences. In the case of these scientific reports back and forth as to whether things are safe or not safe, we obviously have to be careful about being alarmist, but at the same time, we try to get that information out and then let you know where it's coming from. Is it independent? Can you trust it? More and more now that people are online with us, we try to take their questions, answer them as directly as we can. We think we've done pretty well, but you can always do more about, Florida's a really big state. And this, as far as the southwest central Florida part of the state, things are good, and we're trying to get that message out. But ultimately, our first obligation is to the news, and we're not going to soft pedal anything. We're just going to try to give people as much information as they can get and help them judge it themselves. It's a balancing act, if there ever was one.
So Ron Weaver has a similar question that I had also, which is what happens to all of this oil that has settled in the Gulf in the event of a hurricane, in the Gulf of Mexico? Does anyone want to, Commander Boudreau or Director Barnett, is that something you'd like to address?
Something we've seen is as these tropical storms come through, and we had Bonnie, for instance, it is stirring up some potential tar balls or oil that has settled right off the shoreline. And so we do see an increase as far as some oil impacts when these storms come through, and I think it just agitates the surface and brings up some of this oil. I think as time goes on, from what I'm being told, is these tar balls tend to collect sand and sediment. They start to sink, and again, as the waters become turbulent, we will see these impacts increase somewhat, and we've seen that with some of these storms come through. So that's probably the best I could answer on that, and that's just from what we've seen so far.
And any sort of sense of how far that would go into the future? Is that something we're going to be dealing with for the next 10 years, given the, we don't know if it's 50 million gallons or 150 million gallons, but it's a lot, even at the low end. So what does that look like for the next decade? Is that something we'll be dealing with for the next decade in terms of storms?
I'm sorry, we missed the beginning of that question. There's a delay with getting the volume turned back on. If you could repeat that, if you give us 1 minute, please.
Yeah, I'm wondering if that is something that's with us for the next decade in terms of hurricanes with 50 to 150 million gallons of oil settled down in the bottom of the Gulf. Oh, you can't?
I'm sorry, we're not hearing the question.
All right. Is there anyone on this panel that would you want to broach the subject of the hurricanes and long-term impacts?
I'll offer an observation. I'm not sure it's a direct answer to the question you're asking, but the oil that has been dispersed and has then fallen through the water column, there are a couple of important principles. The dispersed oil does not coalesce. It doesn't come back together. So over time, as there are more incidents of storms, what's a likely impact, in addition to what you heard described by Director Barnett in terms of the agitation of the tar balls that are present and could make appearances on shorelines, but the dispersed oil that's out in the Gulf is actually just going to get even more and more dispersed, and the agitation from the storms will mean that it'll actually just sort of become even more and more dispersed. It does not come back together. It has a tendency to continue to move further away from itself, if you will. The globules don't come back together. So I offer that as an observation that while no one really knows exactly what happens in the event of a storm, and that was the message that we had before the storm a month ago, that there are experts that are going to continue to pay close attention. And NOAA, having been an integral part of this response, continues to offer terrific expert advice on what's the right thing to expect in terms of the trajectories of storms, and then therefore what preparations should we put into place. And then if there is a resulting impact of oil because of a storm, I think that the people of the Gulf Coast can continue to expect that we'll send out the same army of resources to address it that we have from early stages of this response.
And an army sounds good, but could you be a little more specific about sort of what resources would be made available for these long-term impacts? So if it's 3 hurricane seasons, away, and I understand you said it disperses more. And then I would be interested as to whether or not you actually, BP is sort of settled on some sort of a number. I mean, have you taken a position on, Phil Compton from Sierra Club asked the question again about the difference in the different reports. Has BP sort of taken a posture on that as well, on what's still sitting in the Gulf? And then what is your impact and resources for contending with that over the long term?
So BP, no, has not taken a specific position, and I support the statements made by, I think, each of my fellow panelists here that it's really critically important that the scientific community conduct their debates, as is actually not unusual at all to have disagreements among the academic and scientific community, but that they need to conduct their debates, and we'll get more and more detailed analysis and understanding. They'll have more chance to reflect on the findings and the things that they've seen, and we'll draw some conclusions. To this point, the guidance as provided by the experts that have been part of the Unified Command represents the view that I think is held by Unified Command, and BP as part of Unified Command has adopted that view, but we've taken no positions as to the differing observations being made.
So let's shift a little bit to sort of economics. One of the issues I know that's is a bit troubling for people in this neck of the woods is because we haven't had oil on our beaches. I've already heard that a number of entities have been turned down for claims, even though our tourism and our folks visiting and going to restaurants have been clearly impacted. It's obvious that the oil spill impacted our area, but that they're being denied claims because we don't have oil on our beaches. Can you sort of speak to how people here will be made whole in the Tampa and probably Sarasota and Naples and lots of other beaches?
I can. So I've spoken to people, frankly, along the entire west coast of Florida about this very issue, and I understand that it is just critically and urgently important to the businesses, the hotels, the restaurants, the charter boat fishing operations, and others that are associated with the tourism industry along this coastline. First, an important clarification. The assertion made that claims have been denied because there's been no oil on the coastline on the West Coast is actually not quite the right language. Many claims have in fact been paid to those that have been impacted in the tourism industry along the West Coast, and that $40 million of claims paid in the state of Florida certainly includes some claims that are associated with tourism. And the message that we put out about 2 weeks ago now, maybe a little less than 2 weeks ago, wasn't that claims were not going to be paid or that they've been denied, but we made a very conscious and intentional decision to defer the further analysis and ultimate decision-making on a number of claims associated with tourism impacts in areas where there has not been direct oil impact. And to be very frank, I think it's a really important decision to put into the hands of the independent administrator the opportunity and the authority to interpret the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, to interpret state law and other guidelines to reach a decision that actually was in the interests of those businesses and all of us as stakeholders in the state, and to remove BP as the arbiter, if you will, or the ultimate decision maker on claims that were not very clearly defined within the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. So I offer you that as an important clarification. The assertion that claims have been denied is actually not quite right. A number have been paid, and indeed in the last 2 weeks a number have been consciously deferred, and they will be picked up by the independent administrator as he assumes responsibility on Monday, the 23rd.
And can you just a little further, can you speak to losses in property values for probably lots of people in this room, including myself, whose home isn't worth what it was on April 19th, and then the resulting lost tax revenues to the state of Florida that funds all sorts of, programs and services and
Yeah, two different dimensions. I'll start at the second and then come back. The tax revenues, I won't speak to them specifically as property tax revenues, but broadly, revenues, fees, taxes that are lost by local governments are eligible for claims through our local government entity claims process. And that element of the claims process will actually be retained by BP. Local governments will not have to be within the same sort of list of claims process and information flow that the individuals and businesses will be within, and the local government entity claims will continue to be managed, processed, and dealt with directly by BP. And so lost revenues will be a function of that process. As it relates to property value, that's a really difficult one, and it is something that is very, very much outside the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, and falls in that space of something that I think it's been really valuable to have an independent administrator to offer some views. Just yesterday, Ken Feinberg, in a town hall, I think in Pensacola, if I remember that right, made some comments about the intentions he has for a framework for claims once he starts on Monday. And I understand he made a footnote as it relates to real estate agencies or brokerages. And the understanding I have is that he doesn't intend for real estate brokerage claims to be paid through the independent claims facility, but there would be an entirely separate fund that would be put aside and managed and coordinated to attempt to make whole losses incurred by those that operate in the real estate industry. So that's going to be within his charge and within his remit, and I don't know any more than the little extract that I picked up from the comments that he made just yesterday.
Very good. You mentioned earlier, and I was interested to hear you talk about the $50 million toward behavioral health and $3 million that's coming to Florida. I know they studied folks in Alaska, and they were significantly almost 4 times more likely to experience anxiety and almost 3 times more likely to experience post-traumatic stress disorder and doubly to experience depression. And I know there was an unfortunate incident where someone who was in the fishing business had taken his own life, feeling very distraught over the future. So can you speak to a little bit of it? I mean, to be honest, $3 million to Florida doesn't seem like a lot of money, even $50 million, when you're really changing sometimes people's cultures, particularly along Louisiana. I mean, can you talk to that and how you arrived at that figure, and is that sort of the end of that conversation about mental health and related issues?
Yeah, I'm happy to, again, offer what I understand about this. The conversation about behavioral health and mental health, I believe, is just really important. And as you noted, the example of the fisherman who took his own life, that's tragic. And this bill has really, in a profound and deeply personal way, impacted on people's lives. And many of us have seen some of those impacts. Many of you, I know, have either interests or family, or maybe yourself. You live on the coast, and just the concern, the fear, the uncertainty of how this might impact you, I know it weighs. And so the commitment to contribute towards behavioral health is something that BP took as very serious. But specifically to your question, I'll tell you that we recognize we're not the experts in this space. And we worked very closely with the behavioral health experts within each of the states and at the federal level to develop a plan for what it is that we should do to just make a contribution towards this challenge. Importantly, the initial proposal from the state of Florida for support that they saw as important in the state was for only $1.7 million. So the ultimate grant that was made by BP for the state of Florida was actually beyond that initial request. The request was revised, and I'll tell you that each of the states worked with their counterparts in each of the 4 or 5 Gulf states to understand the independent proposals that had been developed and to reconcile between them the impact, the scale, the implications as it did vary state by state. And then the ultimate agreement was a function of a discussion between BP, but frankly, very much including the state leads, if you will, in each of the respective states.
So I had a couple of people asking questions about seafood safety, and we're assured that the FDA is conducting tests of seafood, but Mark Mueller asked, he's not heard sort of actual test results and sample sizes and how this is being made publicly aware. Jim Parker also asked a similar question about the impact on the food chain long term. Alan, do you want to speak a little bit to that and maybe the role of EPA and DEP working together for doing sampling? And
I couldn't speak to DEP's role. I'll leave that for the director. But from EPA's perspective, our role is to continue with monitoring and providing those analyses to the FDA and to NOAA so that they can make decisions about the seafood and about whether or not to open up the harvesting.
So do you do the actual testing and then FDA uses that information, and is that available online publicly?
Of the waters and the sediments, yes. Mm-hmm. It's all available publicly.
And is it FDA doing, or is it the Department of Agriculture here that does the fish Does anyone on the panel know who's testing the actual seafood itself? I think that's actually the Department of Agriculture's seafood safety. Either Commander or Director Barnett, can you speak at all to the seafood issue?
Yes, and that would be Department of Agriculture does the testing for the seafood. Some of the things we've seen recently is, and again, this is an event that happens yearly during the summertime, are fish kills. And we have responded to those, obviously, for the fear that is the oil incident related to the fish kills. And the tests have come back as far as the ones we responded to, that they are dissolved oxygen in the water, which are common with the very hot time now during the summer. So but Department of Agriculture does check for the seafood, and I believe they do work in conjunction with the FDA and to assure the safety of the public that consume these products.
Great. I'm just going to ask one more question, and then I'm trying to keep everybody on schedule, and Senator Jones and Representative Long will come up and make closing comments. But there is a lot of concerns, and I think, Neil, you managed to rip all our hearts out with those pictures of the birds. I myself just couldn't even watch pictures. I can't even look at pictures like that. What species has been most affected by the disaster, and what is, what are the various agencies in BP doing to help the wildlife recover? Any wildlife experts there? Yeah. Okay, so there we go. So, Director Barnett, did you want to respond to the wildlife question?
I'm sorry, I didn't pick up the entire question. We were having a problem with the mute being released for us to hear the entire question.
The question was about wildlife and which species was most affected and what's being done to help. Well, this is a new experience.
We'll try to get an answer.
On the first panel, we actually had Laurie McDonald with Defenders of Wildlife. And go ahead. Did you want to respond, Ray?
So this won't be the answer, but again, I'll offer some things from my understanding. And in fact, there is data available on the websites that have been put into place. One recently established by the federal government that gives actually very specific and detailed numbers accounting for the wildlife impacts. The single largest number in terms of quantity for impacts have been birds and a variety of specific species of birds. There certainly have been impacts as well to sea turtles and a handful of other types of wildlife, if you will, that have made their homes in and around the Gulf. I think it's really important to reinforce that every single impact to wildlife has been treated as urgent. And just yesterday, or actually earlier today, I think is actually true, Admiral Thad Allen was in Cedar Key, just north of here, a few hours, and they released 23 turtles back into the environment in Cedar Key that had been rescued and rehabilitated. They were brought in, some of them severely oiled, some of them only moderately oiled, but the care provided through this response was we were able to rehabilitate them and actually move them over to Cedar Key area where there's been no impact and put them back into an environment very much like their own home. Throughout the response, there were several instances where birds, pelicans and a handful of other species were brought over from Louisiana where they had been oiled, had been rehabilitated and then released into the St. Pete area where there's been no oil and it was an environment that was very much like their home. So I offer you that without answering your question in real detail because the numbers I don't have committed to memory, but they are available on the website, publicly available in full detail. But it's been an important part of this response.
Alan?
And I was going to add to that, although none of us have those numbers at our disposal, I am very much aware that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is part of the Department of the Interior, as well as our state organizations, have been very active in Unified Command and trying to rescue the birds, and with the additional help of NGOs and other volunteers throughout this process. So that information, I've seen it on the websites for U.S. Fish and Wildlife. It is there. It's available.
Very good. Neil?
I'll add one last thing, which is that with the fullness of time, I do think that the the newspaper, our website, the media in general can help, in a sense, with a scorecard over time. You know, some of this it's just hard to know as you're all struggling with. And so whether it's at the 6-month point, the 8-month point, the year point, I think it's important that we find some independent accounting of what's going on, and that's a role we embrace.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask Ray one last question while Senator Jones and Representative Long come up. And this is a good segue really to our next session, which is going to be October 2nd on solutions. So I direct the Florida Business Network for Clean Energy Economy. So we're all about transitioning to a low-carbon economy. So I want to know what happened to Beyond Petroleum and BP, and now that the well is capped, you know, is BP going to continue sort of the drilling in the Gulf? And as it's harder and harder to find more oil. We call it tough oil now, right? And we're having to go, you know, many miles below the surface and so forth to find oil. So where is BP on that? And you were leaders for a time. It seemed, and that seems to have retracted in the last couple of years. So if you could perhaps speak to that.
Yeah, it's a great question. We have indeed been one of the leaders in the industry in deep water exploration and production. We are, in fact, the largest producer of oil and natural gas in the United States of America, which is something that probably is not what you would anticipate, not something you would guess, especially given the scale of some of our very formidable competitors in the industry. But BP has a very, very deep and long history of being an energy partner for this country. And BP's continued operation as a provider of energy in the United States is a matter of corporate priority. So I wouldn't suggest to you that we intend to go away. I do think the notion of Beyond Petroleum, which we introduced at the time that we completed a series of mergers and acquisitions and we became the BP that we are today. It was never meant to be the name of the company, but it was a really important tagline that we wanted to introduce. And I think the principles and the spirit behind that, they really do remain. BP today remains one of the largest investors in alternative energy, especially among those that operate in the oil and natural gas business. Even this year, we've completed the completion of an acquisition of a biofuel company right here in the state of Florida. And we continue to grow our solar business, our wind business in North America. And we've made really large investments towards advanced biofuels, a $500 million research institute based out on the West Coast to help ensure that over time we are part of the solution of moving to a green energy economy. We're committed to the idea that we're an energy company. We're not an oil company, and we want to be an energy company for generations to come. So this has been a terrible tragedy, and we're going to learn lessons from this as it relates to the core of our oil exploration and production business. But we surely haven't given up and certainly haven't abandoned the notion that the long-term solution for energy security in the United States and elsewhere, it requires and demands a real long-term commitment to development of alternative energy sources.
Hear, hear. Thank you very much, Commander Boudreau and Director Barnett. I appreciate your patience with our technology, and if our esteemed elected officials would come up to in the evening. And I appreciate all your kind attention and the panelists for your answers and being here this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. You did a great job in your moderation. And it's hard to get through all the questions, I know. But I would like to thank St. Petersburg College, and especially our president, Dr. Bill Law, our provost, Dr. Jim Oliver, for presenting these two community forums. We had over 75 questions from the audience in our first forum, plus the questions we received tonight. And the speakers, well, they've come to us with state and national credentials. We're very fortunate to have them here. Because of your attendance and interest, you, the audience, now have more factual information than the members that are sitting in the legislature. That's a true fact. That's a true fact. So you congratulate yourself. It's already been mentioned, but please mark your calendar for Saturday, October 2nd, where the St. Petersburg College will then offer its third community forum, where we will basically include solutions to the oil crisis as we look to the future. My colleague? Representative Long.
Thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us this evening. I'd like to personally thank all of our panelists this evening who've done such an incredible job. Don't you think? Let's give them all a hand. I also would like to thank our sponsors who made this evening possible, from Bright House, who put us up on the air, the St. Petersburg Times, who published our ads, Progress Energy, who plays such a critical role in the solutions ahead, the trade winds, and the Florida Restaurant and Lodging Association. And what a generous opportunity the Trade Winds has extended to all of us who have come to these events with their certificate for a free night at the Trade Winds to promote our beautiful beaches. We'd also like to thank the Chamber of Commerce, Seminole, Largo, and Clearwater. And I know that you are all aware that Senator Jones and I and the members of the Florida legislature are going to be dealing with this issue in the coming months ahead to ensure that all Floridians are made whole and this type of catastrophe never happens again. Your input as we move forward is critically important to all of us. We know that the solutions ahead will not be easy, and that alternative energy sources and renewable and sustainable energy is a hugely important issue facing our state and our nation. It is so easy for all of us to become complacent now that this oil well has been capped. But the problems that we will face for the next several decades in our oceans, you have to think of the Gulf of Mexico as the rainforest of our oceans. So we all have a vested interest in ensuring that we find out what happened, we find out how to never let this happen again, and that we do develop a public policy for our state and for our country. Thank you for being here, and please come back and join us on October 2nd. Oh, and Senator Jones wants me to tell you all that we are now adjourned. Thank you.